When the Military Intelligence Branch was created on July 1, 1962, it was the Army's first new branch in 20 years. Today, it remains one of the youngest of the Army's basic branches. Yet while the Military Intelligence Branch is a relatively recent addition, intelligence operations and functions in the Army stretch back to the Revolutionary War.
Without intelligence, the commander is blind. Only through reasoned application of information supplied by intelligence is he able to make sound decisions. At all echelons, the commander must know the enemy he faces or is about to face.
These words could have been written in 1776, or they could have been written yesterday. In fact, they were written by Brigadier General Oscar W. Koch, General George Patton's G2 during World War II. While the purpose of intelligence operations has not changed in more than 2 centuries, the Army has adapted its organizations, collection methods, and technologies to meet new challenges as they arose. This film traces that evolution, one marked by slow, steady progress, albeit intermittent at times, and the contributions of far-sighted and determined commanders and MI professionals. Though it initially struggled for parity with other branches, military intelligence emerged as a permanent and essential component of the Army and its operations. In July 1775, General George Washington assumed command of the newly established Continental Army. Over the next 8 years of the Revolutionary War, he displayed a keen understanding of the importance of military intelligence. His letters to his commanders often addressed the importance of intelligence.
As it is of great consequence to gain intelligence of the enemy's designs and of their intended operations, I cannot but recommend your attention to this subject.
Washington personally scrutinized available information on the enemy. Acting as his own intelligence officer, he never willingly depended on a single source, thus founding the basic tenet of Army intelligence. Washington relied on combat units, such as Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton's Rangers, to perform vital reconnaissance functions at the forward edge of battle. However, to look beyond the front lines, he turned to networks of spies. One of his most effective spy networks was Major Benjamin Talmadge's Culper spy ring, organized in 1778 to provide intelligence on British forces in New York City. Talmadge's 2 main agents, Abraham Woodhull of Long Island and Robert Townsend of New York City, used the code names Samuel Culper and Samuel Culper Jr., respectively. Initially, the ring's methods were straightforward. Townsend sent reports to Woodhull via a courier, Austin Rowe, who buried the reports. Woodhull recovered them, added his own observations, and gave them to Lieutenant Caleb Brewster to transport across Long Island Sound to Major Talmadge. Talmadge inserted his own analysis and forwarded the reports to Washington via dispatch riders. As the Culper ring matured, it adopted more secure methods, including the use of secret inks, ciphers, and codes. The Culper spy ring was a successful intelligence system that came together through careful planning and direction. At the top, Washington issued precise instructions to Talmadge. At the bottom, each individual had specific missions and practiced solid tradecraft. Talmadge, in the middle, ensured his agents had the necessary resources and an effective system of communication. The Culper ring's steady flow of accurate intelligence provided Washington with excellent situational awareness and allowed him to conduct successful operations. The ring's most dramatic success came in July 1780. Anticipating the arrival of a French army at Newport, Rhode Island, Washington sought information about the British situation in New York City. Talmadge's network learned the British planned to attack the French before they could properly establish their defenses. This timely intelligence allowed Washington to maneuver his forces as if to attack Manhattan, which prompted the British to call off their attack on the French. As a result, the French were able to provide much-needed support to the tired Continental Army and assist in its eventual victory over British forces in 1783. Unfortunately, when the Revolutionary War ended, the Culper ring and the rest of Washington's spy networks were dismantled, and Army intelligence fell dormant. Without an intelligence-minded leader at its helm, the Army of the early 19th century did little to collect or analyze information about potential enemies. One positive development occurred in 1814, when the War Department created an organization to reconnoiter and map routes in support of military operations. By 1838, the organization had become the elite corps of topographical engineers. Over the following decades, these engineers provided invaluable geographic and cultural intelligence of the regions beyond the Mississippi River, paving the way for settlement of the American West. During the Mexican War, Major General Winfield Scott employed the engineers, along with his cavalry, to uncover potential avenues of approach and enemy positions. Scott also used spies to gather information. His Inspector General, Lieutenant Colonel Ethan Allen Hitchcock, hired a well-known Mexican gang leader and more than 100 prisoners to work as guides, couriers, scouts, and spies for the U.S. Army. This group was dubbed the Mexican Spy Company. These ad hoc intelligence operations of the early 19th century retained a focus on traditional sources. In nearly 75 years, the intelligence field had changed little from the days of the Revolutionary War. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, neither the Union nor the Confederacy had an effective, centralized intelligence organization. Some commanders personally supervised intelligence operations, while others assigned the responsibility to members of their staff. The result was a hodgepodge of improvised intelligence structures with minimal coordination and limited effectiveness. Early in the war, Major General George B. McClellan, in command of the Union forces in Virginia, brought in Allen Pinkerton to establish an intelligence service. Pinkerton, the head of a private detective agency, excelled in counterintelligence work and, to a large degree, shut down Confederate spy networks in and around Washington. He was less successful, however, as a tactical intelligence officer, often developing exaggerated estimates of the enemy's strength. On the other hand, Confederate General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, did not establish an intelligence service. Instead, he relied on his cavalry commander, Major General Jeb Stuart, to be the eyes of his army. In February 1863, Major General Joseph Hooker, the new commander of the Union Army of the Potomac, established the Bureau of Military Information, or BMI, under the direction of Colonel George H. Sharp. To assist running the Bureau, Sharp had two key assistants. John Babcock, a civilian, was Sharp's chief interrogator, who also sketched maps and compiled order of battle charts. Captain John McAtee organized scouting operations and assisted with interrogations. The Bureau employed a number of scouts to gather information on the enemy's location and movements. It also assembled an impressive enemy order of battle through the systematic interrogations of enemy prisoners and deserters. By mid-1863, Sharp's intelligence service knew General Lee's army, its commanders, and its locations. While both armies relied on spies and scouts, their cavalry units provided the single most important source of combat intelligence. The modern nature and large scale of the Civil War, however, also broadened the intelligence sources available. Information came from newspapers, Signal Corps observation posts, captured correspondence, and communication intercepts, particularly from wiretapping telegraph lines. Civil War armies also experimented temporarily with aerial reconnaissance from hot air balloons. By collecting information from all these sources, Sharp developed one of the first all-source efforts in American military intelligence. Sharp and his staff collated and analyzed information and presented it in daily written reports to the commanders of the Army of the Potomac. Intelligence had become an integral part of the Army staff. The value of the Bureau of Military Information to operational planning was demonstrated during the Gettysburg Campaign in the summer of 1863. Sharp learned of Lee's march up the Shenandoah Valley through Maryland and into Pennsylvania. He sent scouts out to pinpoint Lee's army as it moved north, allowing Union forces to assume an advantageous position around Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. As the armies clashed on July 1st and 2nd, Sharp continued to update his picture of the enemy. Despite the high-pressure situation of an ongoing battle, he developed a remarkably accurate estimate of Confederate strength. On the evening of July 2nd, Sharp reported that Major General George Pickett's division was the only fresh unit available to Lee. Based largely on this information, Union Commander Major General George Meade chose to continue the fight the next day. As predicted, Lee used Pickett's uncommitted brigades to launch one final attack on July 3rd. It failed, leaving the Union forces victorious. When the Civil War ended in April 1865, wartime arrangements for gathering intelligence disappeared once again. Despite the success of the Bureau of Military Information, the Army did not foresee any need for a permanent intelligence organization in peacetime. In the decades following the Civil War, the Army's primary mission was to police and pacify the American West. By the 1880s, however, the United States began looking beyond its own borders. It was at this time that the Army established its first permanent intelligence organization at the national level. In October 1885, Brigadier General Richard Drum, the Army's Adjutant General, created the Military Information Division to collect military data on foreign armies. 4 years later, the division assumed responsibility for the Army's new military attaché system, which would constitute the Army's strategic collection asset until World War II. Although mostly a passive repository for military-related information, the Military Information Division was able to provide terrain and order of battle information and detailed maps for the war against Spain. For the first time, the Army entered into a conflict with a semblance of intelligence preparation. When the American Army found itself fighting in the Philippines, the American commander in Manila created an agency to translate and collate captured documents. This organization evolved into the Division of Military Information under the leadership of Captain Ralph Van Diemen. Van Diemen expanded the division's responsibilities to establish a mapping section, relay intelligence to field commanders, and provide photographs and descriptions of known Filipino insurgents. At the Army level, Secretary of War Elihu Root established the Army's first general staff to perform administrative, intelligence, and planning functions in 1903. The Military Information Division became the General Staff's second division with 4 major duties. For the first time, the intelligence function had achieved equal standing with other staff missions. This equality was only temporary. By 1915, due to bureaucratic maneuvering and competing priorities, military intelligence had been reduced to a committee that existed only on paper. While Army intelligence had almost ceased to exist at the national level, some positive developments occurred in the field. During the 1916 punitive expedition into Mexico to hunt down Mexican revolutionary leader Pancho Villa, Brigadier General John J. Pershing deployed the widest range of intelligence assets the Army had fielded to date. He appointed an intelligence officer, Major James A. Ryan, who made effective use of local informants, horse cavalry, and Indian scouts. These traditional collection methods were supported by newly emerging technologies, including the airplane and radio tractor. The airplanes made reconnaissance flights and experimented with aerial cameras, while the radio tractors monitored Mexican communications. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Major Van Diemen had been assigned to the General Staff, where he applied knowledge gained from his previous intelligence experiences. Van Diemen was appalled at the state of Army intelligence in 1915 and urged his superiors to re-establish a separate and robust intelligence organization. Initially, the Army leadership ignored Van Diemen's recommendations. Fortunately, he continued his lobbying and finally met with success once the United States entered World War I. On May 3, 1917, the Secretary of War established a military intelligence section, with Van Diemen as its chief. The Army once again had a functional intelligence organization at the national level. Moreover, the new designation, military intelligence, rather than military information, signified the new approaches Army intelligence would take over the next 18 months. During World War I, the evolution of Army intelligence proceeded along 2 parallel lines. In the United States, military intelligence developed into a full-fledged member of the War Department General Staff, while in France, the American Expeditionary Forces, or AEF, established its own field intelligence organization to meet tactical and operational needs. At the War Department, Van Diemen's modest military intelligence section supervised Army attachés, developed intelligence policies and plans, and controlled the Army's counter-espionage efforts within the United States. Van Diemen separated his staff missions into positive intelligence, collecting information from the enemy, and negative intelligence, preventing the enemy from collecting information about one's own forces. By doing so, he established the first fields of specialization for intelligence personnel. Other organizations developed were the Corps of Interpreters, which provided competent linguists to the Army, and the Corps of Intelligence Police, or CIP, a group of non-commissioned officers who performed counterintelligence operations in France and the continental United States. One of the most innovative aspects of Van Diemen's organization was the establishment of a cryptologic capability at the War Department level. His Code and Cipher Bureau, under the direction of Herbert Yardley, prepared codes for the War Department and solved about 50 foreign codes during the war. By the end of the war, the Military Intelligence Section had grown into the Military Intelligence Division, one of 4 principal divisions on the General Staff. Military intelligence had finally been restored to a position of institutional equality on the Army General Staff. While Van Diemen worked to develop the national intelligence function in the United States, General John Pershing arrived in France and began to organize what would become the 1 million-man American Expeditionary Forces. Pershing divided his staff into personnel, intelligence, operations, and supply sections, designated G1, G2, G3, and G4, respectively. Thus, the G2 became the staff responsible for intelligence. Major Dennis Nolan, the AEF's G2, divided his section into 4 divisions: Military Information, Secret Service, Topographic, and Censorship and Press. By the end of the war, it had grown into a full-fledged theater intelligence center. Under the AEF, intelligence sections from Army to battalion level collected and analyzed information along their own fronts. Each G2 or S2 section was responsible for progressively larger areas of coverage and had wider arrays of resources and a greater number of personnel. Information was passed up to higher headquarters, added to or adjusted, and then furnished back to lower staffs. As the war progressed, the G2s and S2s became increasingly proficient as they learned to work together to create accurate intelligence estimates. An example of this interdependence occurred in mid-October 1918, as the Second Army prepared for the final Allied offensive on the Western Front. The Second Army's G2 first disseminated a graphic intelligence summary that broke down the dispositions of 8 German divisions into regimental sectors, and included incidents of artillery and machine gun fire, gas attacks, and patrols. The 4th Corps G2 further developed the situation of the German divisions in its area of interest. From prisoners, the 28th Division G2 determined the identification and placement of German regiments, strength of outposts, and location of minefields. When all this information was integrated, the intelligence personnel of the Second Army had built a remarkably accurate order of battle of the German forces along their front, which proved invaluable when the American Army began their offensive in early November. World War I was a watershed in the evolution of U.S. Army intelligence. The intelligence function, both at the War Department and in the field, was revitalized and placed on a footing of organizational equality with other major administrative and operational functions. Nolan's G2-S2 system became the framework for intelligence in operational and tactical units into the 21st century, with intelligence personnel in every unit from battalion to field army. In addition to its traditional collection sources, the Army ventured into new fields of counterintelligence, cryptology, signals intelligence, and aerial photography. Finally, although intelligence was not yet an official career field, the Army had begun to recognize the need for specialized skills in this area, represented by the creation of the Corps of Interpreters and Corps of Intelligence Police. For Army intelligence, World War I represented a great leap forward. In the years immediately following World War I, even as funding and manpower decreased, the Army attempted to build upon the intelligence experience it had gained. Foremost, Army intelligence maintained its presence on the War Department General Staff in the post-war period. And in 1921, the chief of the Military Intelligence Division became the Army G2. The Corps of Interpreters was disbanded, but the Corps of Intelligence Police continued to operate, albeit with a much reduced staff. The G2 established the MI Officers Reserve Corps to retain the services of officers who had served in intelligence positions throughout the war and who would theoretically provide a pool of trained manpower in the event of another war. Army intelligence also experimented with new technologies such as aerial photography and radar, but its most notable successes occurred in the field of cryptology. After the war, Herbert Yardley set up a clandestine cryptanalytic unit jointly funded by the Army and the State Department. Dubbed the Black Chamber, the unit primarily worked on diplomatic code breaking, and it achieved some success against Japanese codes in the early 1920s. By 1929, however, Yardley's unit had become increasingly less relevant and was closed. In its place, the Army established the Signal Intelligence Service, or SIS, within the Signal Corps. The new organization was headed by William Friedman. The agency's greatest achievement was the breaking of Purple, the Japanese cipher machine for diplomatic communications. The decrypts of Purple's messages, codenamed Magic, would be the Army's single most important intelligence source in the upcoming war. As the prospect of war increased, Army intelligence began to expand its activities and staff. It refocused its collection activities on Germany, Japan, and Latin America, expanded its attaché system, and issued a series of doctrinal manuals. By the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Army intelligence had taken major strides toward preparing for war. Army intelligence during World War II was built largely on the foundations laid during the previous war. At the national level, the Army G2 and his Military Intelligence Division staff were at the head of Army intelligence. Unlike the World War I agency, however, the MID after 1942 had no operational functions. Instead, it formulated policy and supervised intelligence activities of the Army's three intelligence organizations: the Military Intelligence Service, the Signal Security Agency, and the Counterintelligence Corps. As the operational arm of MID, the Military Intelligence Service, or MIS, collected, analyzed, and disseminated intelligence at both the strategic and tactical levels. It also established the Special Branch to exploit communications intelligence, especially magic decrypts, and later, ultra intelligence, which was derived from the British breaking of the highest German radio codes. Replacing the SIS, the Signal Security Agency was headquartered at Arlington Hall Station near Washington, D.C. The 2nd Signal Service Battalion provided the manpower and command and control for the SSA's collection sites, including 2 new field stations at Vent Hill Farms, Virginia, and 2 Rock Ranch, California. The Counterintelligence Corps, or CIC, was the successor to the Corps of Intelligence Police. One of the CIC's most important assignments was to provide security for the Manhattan Project, the classified program to develop the atomic bomb. In addition to activities in the United States, the Counterintelligence Corps, Signal Security Agency, and the Military Intelligence Service provided direct support for the field units overseas. As the war progressed, Army intelligence matured and expanded. To a large degree, its success depended on the quality of the G2 and S2 staffs that supported the tactical units. Lieutenant General George Patton, the Third Army's commander, valued good intelligence and relied heavily on his G2, Colonel Oscar Koch, to provide him as much information about the enemy as possible. Koch coordinated the intelligence collection efforts of the Third Army's Corps and Division G2s and supervised MIS and CIC teams that he received from the theater. Koch exploited a number of sources to provide situational awareness and develop targets for Patton and his headquarters. He was able to build a balanced and flexible all-source collection organization. By far, prisoners of war were the most important single intelligence source, and Koch's 4 interrogator teams could handle more than 5,000 prisoners per day. Aerial reconnaissance was another significant source of information. Through his G2 air branch, Koch sent aerial reconnaissance missions out 150 miles in front of the Army. On the ground, the Third Army's radio intelligence companies intercepted German radio traffic, located outstations, and conducted limited traffic analysis and cryptanalysis. Koch also had access to the strategic-level ultra-intelligence, which he used to cross-check information coming in from other sources. This balanced collection effort helped Koch accurately estimate the enemy's situation in the Third Army's campaigns in France and Germany. Halfway around the world from the Third Army, Major General Charles Willoughby operated in a different operational and geographical environment. Willoughby was the G2 for General Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area, or SWAPA, stretching from Australia through New Guinea to the Philippines. As Chief Intelligence Officer for a theater, Willoughby's intelligence organizations were multinational and inter-service. However, like Koch, he relied on a variety of intelligence sources. Willoughby organized his G2 staff as a joint intelligence center to produce theater-level intelligence for MacArthur and to coordinate the theater's collection agencies. The most important of these agencies, the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, interrogated captured Japanese soldiers and exploited captured documents. The Allied Geographical Section prepared terrain studies for each of the theater's operations. Finally, the Allied Intelligence Bureau was an umbrella organization for a variety of intelligence and special operation groups, such as the Coast Watchers, a network of observation posts that provided valuable information on Japanese air and naval movements. Willoughby also relied heavily on intelligence assets outside his operational control. The SWAPA's Communication Intelligence Agency, the Central Bureau, conducted traffic analysis to reconstruct Japanese radio networks and also solved several important Japanese radio codes. The effectiveness of Willoughby's intelligence operation was evident during the American forces' successful landing at Hollandia, New Guinea. From order of battle data analysis, he estimated the Japanese force there to be relatively weak. In April 1944, American troops successfully landed at Hollandia to the surprise of the Japanese. Intelligence from a number of sources, including signals intelligence, terrain information, captured documents, and aerial reconnaissance, led MacArthur to launch a devastating bombing raid that destroyed the Hollandia airfields. MacArthur also increased his assault troop strength based on his G2's assessment of the strength of the enemy garrison. World War II has often been referred to as an intelligence war. Undoubtedly, G2s such as Koch and Willoughby established effective intelligence organizations and were able to provide their commanders with actionable intelligence. As the Army transitioned into peacetime, however, it remained to be seen how Army intelligence would fare in the post-war period. In June 1950, war broke out on the Korean Peninsula. To support field commanders, intelligence units were hastily organized and sent to Korea in the early months of the war. As the war progressed, intelligence operations stabilized and were generally conducted on the same lines as those of the latter part of World War II. The Korean War, however, marked the first time intelligence personnel were organized into groups and battalions instead of small independent companies or detachments. The Army fielded 2 new types of intelligence units to provide direct support to units in the field. The first of these units consisted of tailored battalions, companies, and platoons, including photo interpreters, interrogators, and order of battle technicians, deployed to support Division G2s. These units came from one of 3 theater-level groups: the 500th MI Group in Japan, the 513th in Germany, and the 525 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The second type of unit came from the Army's new Signals Intelligence Organization, the Army Security Agency, known as ASA. It fielded group-size formations to Korea, including the 501st Communication Reconnaissance Group in direct support of the U.S. 8th Army in Korea. Signals intelligence more than once provided indications of the enemy's movements and allowed U.S. commanders to position their forces accordingly. In addition to supporting field commanders in Korea, Army intelligence underwent changes at higher levels. In the decades after World War II, it lost some of the scope and authority it had held since the end of the First World War. Between 1947 and 1961, the United States established a number of national intelligence agencies: the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and the Defense Intelligence Agency. Each of these agencies acquired some of the Army's responsibilities and resources for intelligence direction and production. Army intelligence also lost its position and status on the Army staff. After 1956, the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, or AXI, remained a Major General, while other primary staff officers on the Army staff became Lieutenant Generals. During the 1950s and early 1960s, the largest Army intelligence organization was the Army Security Agency. ASA's regional headquarters in Germany and the Pacific exercised control over fixed field stations stretching from the United States to Germany, Turkey, Africa, and the Pacific. Their primary mission was monitoring Soviet bloc communications. The Counterintelligence Corps' largest mission in the early Cold War was supporting the Army's occupation forces. More than half of its strength was deployed overseas in two units: the 66th CIC Group in Germany and the 441st CIC Group in Japan. Counterintelligence agents, particularly those in Germany, actively sought to identify and apprehend spies and agents from the Soviet Union. The demands of Cold War security meant the Counterintelligence Corps had a significant role in the United States as well. The unique 902nd CIC Group was responsible for specialized and high-level activities under the Axis' direct control. Through the early part of the Cold War, successive Axis sought to centralize Army intelligence, concentrating their efforts at Fort Holabird. A CIC center had been established at the Maryland Post in 1945, but it had largely been an administrative and training organization. In 1954, Fort Holabird became the location of the U.S. Army Intelligence Center and assumed control of a number of intelligence organizations, including a photographic interpretation center and the Army's investigative files. Fort Holabird also became the location of the Army Intelligence School. Although the Military Intelligence Training Center at Camp Ritchie, Maryland, had trained more than 20,000 intelligence professionals during World War II, the new Army Intelligence School represented the first permanent, consolidated combat intelligence training center within the Army. Only signals intelligence was taught elsewhere, at the ASA Training Center and School, which had been established in 1951 at Fort Devens, Massachusetts. While attempts to centralize and professionalize Army intelligence had been ongoing since 1917, the discipline reached a major milestone in the 1960s, due primarily to the efforts of Major General Alva Fitch, the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence from 1961 to 1964. Fitch argued that the only solution to ensure the Army had qualified intelligence officers to meet its needs was the creation of a separate intelligence branch for both active duty and reserve officers. Despite opposition, Fitch persevered, and the Army Chief of Staff signed the order creating the Army Intelligence and Security Branch effective July 1, 1962. Initially limited to about 4,000 officers, the branch encompassed all fields of intelligence, including signals, strategic, imagery, combat, human, and counterintelligence. This critical first step evolved over the next 5 years, culminating in the redesignation as the Military Intelligence Branch on July 1, 1967. By then, Army intelligence was heavily involved in the conflict in Vietnam. Prior to 1965, the Army's role in Vietnam had largely been advisory, and the scope of its intelligence activities limited. The Military Assistance Command Vietnam received intelligence support from several Army intelligence detachments and some 200 officers serving as advisors with South Vietnamese troops. In addition, ASA's 3rd Radio Research Unit provided cryptologic support with both aerial and ground-based assets. As the number of U.S. combat troops increased after 1965, the need for operational intelligence also increased. Major General Joseph McChristian, the J-2 for all U.S. forces in Vietnam, oversaw the buildup of intelligence organizations and operations. At the theater level, McChristian's intelligence staff directed operations in both the joint and multinational arenas. Moreover, he realized it was essential for American intelligence personnel to work closely with the South Vietnamese, who knew the terrain, enemy, and most of all, the language. McChristian established 4 multinational intelligence organizations operated by both American and South Vietnamese intelligence personnel. 3 of these centers focused on a specific mission: interrogation, document exploitation, and material exploitation. The 4th, the Combined Intelligence Center, was the production center where information was collated, analyzed, evaluated, and processed into intelligence in support of both U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. Further integration was achieved by placing South Vietnamese intelligence detachments with American units and American detachments in South Vietnamese divisions. By June 1967, the Army had deployed more than 3,500 intelligence soldiers to conduct general, non-cryptologic intelligence operations in Vietnam. Working directly under the J-2's operational control, the 525 MI group supplied the command and control headquarters for 2 subordinate groups, one for counterintelligence operations and the other for field collection. In addition, the 1st MI Battalion oversaw the Army's aerial reconnaissance efforts, while the 519th MI Battalion provided personnel and support for the 4 combined intelligence centers. Supplementing these intelligence activities, 600 American advisors working with their South Vietnamese counterparts made up a network of district intelligence and operations coordinating centers in the countryside. They served as a source of tactical military intelligence and increasingly became involved in uncovering the Viet Cong infrastructure. Finally, for signals intelligence support, the ASA deployed about 1/5 of its total strength to Southeast Asia. After 1966, the 509th Radio Research Group commanded an aviation battalion and 2 radio research battalions, as well as a fixed field station at Phu Bai. ASA also attached tailored companies and detachments to American divisions and brigades. The basis for intelligence support to the tactical commanders remained the interdependent G2-S2 framework. Company-sized MI detachments augmented the Division G2 staff with counterintelligence, order of battle, imagery interpretation, and interrogation sections. In Vietnam, Army intelligence continued to rely heavily on proven, reliable sources of information, such as prisoner interrogation, captured documents, and aerial photography. Signals intelligence saw widespread use at both tactical and theater levels. New technical innovations were also exploited. Divisions and brigades productively used gadgets like unattended ground sensors and airborne personnel detectors, or people sniffers. More importantly, technological advances significantly enhanced the Army's aerial reconnaissance assets. Infrared and side-looking airborne radars complemented the more traditional visual and photographic aerial surveillance methods. Likewise, ASA field units increased their effectiveness with newly developed airborne radio direction finding. This expanding use of technology in Vietnam would have a lasting effect on Army intelligence. Immediately following the Vietnam War, Army intelligence, like the rest of the Army, faced reductions. The U.S. Army Intelligence Command, created in 1965 to handle counterintelligence operations within the continental United States, was replaced by the smaller U.S. Army Intelligence Agency. The Army Security Agency also underwent retrenchment, inactivating a 1/4 of its units and several field stations. On a positive note, the Army finally established a centralized training center for Army intelligence. In 1970, training was taking place at 3 different schools around the United States. General McChristian, who became the AXI in 1968, proposed a single center where intelligence personnel could train and work together. After studying several potential sites, Fort Huachuca, Arizona was chosen to be the home of military intelligence. The Army Intelligence School at Fort Holabird moved all its courses to the new U.S. Army Intelligence Center and School by the end of 1971. Still more changes were in store. In 1974, the Army commissioned the Intelligence Organization and Stationing Study, or IOS, to restructure Army intelligence. The IOS panel's final report was critical of Army intelligence. At the top, it found the AXI did not facilitate proper supervision of all intelligence agencies, especially signals intelligence, and that intelligence production was fragmented among too many agencies. The report sharply criticized ASA for not adequately meeting the requirements of tactical commanders. Moreover, ASA, with its own personnel, training, and research and development systems, was functionally independent of the Army. This independence created a stovepipe of signals intelligence, which worked against the effective development of all-source intelligence. In 1976, the Army began to implement the IOS proposals, resulting in a sweeping reorganization of Army intelligence. On January 1, 1977, Army Security Agency was replaced by the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command, or INSCOM, with Major General William Rolla as the first commanding general. INSCOM was considerably smaller than its ASA predecessor, yet it still controlled a vast array of diverse assets, including 4 theater military intelligence groups, a variety of counterintelligence and human intelligence functional units, and 8 fixed field stations. By bringing together the full spectrum of intelligence disciplines, INSCOM provided the Army with a single instrument to conduct and coordinate intelligence operations at the level above Corps, and provide finished intelligence to meet the Army's needs. The second of the IOS reforms was the creation of Combat Electronic Warfare Intelligence, or CEWI tactical units. Each of the Army's divisional MI companies, which included interrogators, counterintelligence specialists, and imagery interpreters with remote sensors and ground surveillance assets, was combined with a tactical ASA unit. This consolidated all intelligence and electronic warfare assets in a single unit, organic to a division. By 1988, each of the Army's 18 divisions had an organic CEWI battalion. The CEWI concept was expanded to include CEWI groups at the Corps level and CEWI companies for the separate brigades and armored cavalry regiments. One of the last recommendations of the IOS report was to move responsibility for the ASA Training Center and School at Fort Devens to the Army Intelligence Center and School at Fort Huachuca. This paved the way for the eventual closure of Fort Devens and consolidation of all Army intelligence training at the Huachuca site. By the end of the 1980s, Army intelligence had dedicated assets to support every level in the Army. To provide oversight for these assets, the Army upgraded its intelligence position on the Army staff, and the 2-star AXI became a 3-star Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, or DECINT. Lieutenant General Sidney Weinstein became the first DECINT in May 1987. 2 months later, on July 1, 1987, the Army established the Military Intelligence Corps as part of the regimental system, which embodied the Army's heritage and traditions. The establishment of the Corps signaled that Army intelligence was now a single, cohesive community in the Army's mainstream. Throughout the reorganizations and structural changes of the 1970s and 80s, Army intelligence personnel were still conducting real-world collection and threat reduction operations for the Cold War. Nothing brought this home more clearly than 2 counterintelligence triumphs. In 1988, Army counterintelligence agents in Europe tracked down Clyde Conrad, a retired Army non-commissioned officer who was a key figure in an espionage ring that betrayed NATO war plans to the Hungarian intelligence service. Later, INSCOM's foreign counterintelligence activity arrested Army warrant officer James Hall, who sold American secrets to the Soviets. The Army's new CEWI units were designed to fight on a conventional battlefield. Initially, however, they were used almost exclusively in unconventional environments. SEWE units participated in the 1983 Operation Urgent Fury in Grenada and the 1989 Operation Just Cause in Panama. During Operation Just Cause to depose Panamanian strongman Manuel Noriega, deployed SEWE units combined with in-theater INSCOM assets to provide effective intelligence support. MI soldiers in Panama interrogated members of Noriega's defense force, screened documents, and provided low-level voice intercepts. Meanwhile, INSCOM's 470th MI Brigade used their sources to obtain critical information on enemy troop movements, location of weapons caches, and helped apprehend a number of Noriega's top aides. Less than a year later, halfway around the world, American military forces under the control of U.S. Central Command, better known as CENTCOM, deployed to Saudi Arabia after Iraq invaded Kuwait. To support these forces, the Army's 2 corps and 8 divisions deployed their organic MI units, amounting to 14 battalions and 2 brigades of intelligence assets. INSCOM also deployed the 513th MI Brigade and other elements to provide support at the theater level, and the Army Intelligence Agency produced tactical intelligence for the American ground forces. Major General John Stewart, the U.S. Army Central Command's G2, led the Army's intelligence effort. His staff synchronized intelligence collection, production, and dissemination with planned operations and provided key reads of the enemy situation for tactical commanders. Stewart also established a series of communications links to quickly exchange battlefield reports with the corps and to connect with analysts and databases at the AIA. The connection with AIA was particularly valuable. The agency's analysts produced a series of highly accurate tactical 1 to 50,000 scale templates depicting the location of every Iraqi division, as well as weapons and fortification locations. Digitally transmitted to the Army Central Command G2, the template overlays were transferred to maps, produced into overprinted map sheets, and sent to ground forces. Afterwards, AIA delivered daily updates. The agency also augmented Stewart's personnel and provided analysts to the Joint Intelligence Center, which supported CENTCOM's operations. In short, AIA provided deployed intelligence assets the capability to reach back to expertise and information. A number of intelligence sources contributed to the efforts of ground forces. Army Signals Intelligence picked up useful intelligence on the movement and identification of Iraqi units. Electronic jamming operations drove the Iraqis to use less secure communications that were easily intercepted. These operations allowed analysts to develop relatively accurate targeting of Iraqi mobile surface-to-surface missiles. The Army also established 2 joint interrogation facilities to process and gather intelligence from prisoners, deserters, and other line crossers. These facilities, together with division and corps confinement centers, processed more than 70,000 enemy prisoners by the end of the war. Finally, tactical commanders' insatiable demand for imagery was met by 2 developmental imagery systems: the Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System, or Joint STARS, an airborne system that could detect moving targets on the ground, and unmanned aerial vehicles equipped with television cameras or other sensors. While Army intelligence was ultimately successful, Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm pointed to new challenges for the future. No longer would it have the advantage of facing a familiar enemy on the familiar terrain of a European battlefield. Army intelligence would have to project itself into a theater of operations quickly and effectively, with improved dissemination capabilities to focus intelligence down to the tactical commanders. With the end of the Cold War in 1991, the Army withdrew much of its European presence, becoming largely based in the continental United States. As a result, the Army was concerned with deploying its forces from numerous bases over long distances. Army intelligence also had to adapt to this new environment. G2s and S2s continued to manage intelligence collection, production, and dissemination within their units. MI brigades and battalions remained at corps and division levels to perform situation and target development and force protection using a variety of collection assets. INSCOM also continued to provide support to the field through its theater brigades and to national agencies through its functional groups. To support the Army's strategic power projection operations, however, Army intelligence developed a new concept with a flexible, tailored system of systems. Using reliable automated communications, national and theater-level assets were linked with tactical units, allowing everyone access to the same information. A key element of this concept was the Deployable Intelligence Support Element, or DICE. The DICE was an intelligence team with a suite of communications and automation equipment capable of deploying with the Army's early entry forces. Its size and composition were tailored to its mission, but could be altered or expanded as necessary. The DICE allowed deployed commanders at every level to access the larger intelligence system. Army intelligence successfully used these concepts in a series of contingencies throughout the 1990s, mostly peace-enforcing and peacekeeping operations like those in the Balkans, Somalia, and Haiti. In this new environment, Army intelligence also tackled the problem of sharing information with multinational partners, sometimes those who had been enemies only a few years earlier. Intelligence professionals had to adapt to a new problem set. Instead of databases of order of battle and target folders, MI analysts created lists of high-value personalities, weapon storage sites, and even license plates. As a result, tactical human intelligence regained its importance, returning Army intelligence to its roots from 200 years earlier. With the terrible events of September 11, 2001, Army intelligence once again adapted to new threats in Afghanistan and Iraq as part of the global war on terror. In these active theaters, Army intelligence fielded new technologies for intelligence gathering and reporting. Biometrics, the identification of humans by their characteristics or traits, allowed tactical forces to recognize and track individuals of security interest, a critical capability in counterinsurgency operations. With the emergence of geospatial intelligence, a combination of imagery and geospatial information, tactical commanders gained a new way of visualizing the battlefield. In addition, more established intelligence sources continued to provide useful information for commanders in the field. Signals intelligence provided information on insurgent networks and operations, while imagery, often from unmanned aerial systems, furnished situational awareness and important targeting assets at all levels. Documented media exploitation augmented these efforts. However, the Army became more dependent on human intelligence, or HUMINT, in the form of interrogators and interaction with the local community to gather information on the intangible factors of counterinsurgency. After 2007, the Army converted to a brigade-based force, requiring a more robust intelligence collection and analysis capability at the Brigade Combat Team, or BCT level. The new BCTs had organic MI companies with human and signals intelligence, unmanned aerial systems, and analytical assets. Brigade and Battalion S2 sections expanded and included one officer specifically assigned to coordinate the HUMINT assets. To support BCT intelligence assets, the Army converted the corps-level MI brigades to battlefield surveillance brigades. These brigades contained ground-based signals intelligence assets, but were heavily weighted with counterintelligence and HUMINT teams to reinforce BCT operations. With its ability to draw on soldiers and information around the world, INSCOM played a major role in global operations. Its theater brigades manned joint intelligence centers, tracked terrorist activities in their areas, and supported Army tactical commanders with intelligence. Reflecting the growing importance of HUMINT, INSCOM also had battalions specifically designed to operate within a joint interrogation and debriefing center. As the global war on terror continued, all aerial exploitation battalions were assigned to INSCOM. This allowed increased readiness and more efficient use of these low-density, high-demand aviation assets. Another aerial asset fielded by the Army in both Iraq and Afghanistan was Task Force Odin: observe, detect, identify, and neutralize. Relying heavily on a variety of new, non-standard imagery technologies, the task force used both manned and unmanned aerial assets to detect and counter improvised explosive devices. Finally, in October of 2011, the 780th MI Brigade was activated at Fort Meade, Maryland, to conduct signals intelligence, computer network operations, and, when directed, offensive operations in support of Army and joint operations worldwide. From George Washington and John Pershing to George Patton and today's leaders, a commander's need for accurate, actionable intelligence has never wavered. Over the past 2 centuries, Army intelligence has evolved and grown. Through learning, adapting, and anticipating requirements, a military intelligence branch of dedicated professionals emerged to ensure commanders have the knowledge they need to succeed. From humble beginnings, Army intelligence has developed into a highly sophisticated branch. The temporary organizations of the 18th and 19th centuries morphed into unique organizations with specific missions, and finally, to consolidated MI units at every level. The myth that any soldier could do intelligence has given way to the dedicated specialization of intelligence professionals. New disciplines and forms of collection continue to be incorporated, while the traditional methods remain critical. The impact of military intelligence throughout history has been significant. Undoubtedly, MI will remain a vital part of the Army and Army operations.